The film director John Boorman was fascinated by the Holy Grail, by the myth of the Holy Grail. The first live-action film he made for the BBC, he was working for the BBC as a documentary filmmaker. The first live-action film he made featured a sculptor named Arthur King. And Arthur King's goal is to carve out of the stone a figure that would serve as his own personal grail. The grail in this case being an object that symbolizes a wholeness or health that would empower someone to overcome despair, or call it an inner wasteland. Now, the Grail legend became very important in English literature. Well, really from the times of the Middle Ages, but I'm talking more about the 20th century. T.S. Eliot famously in The Wasteland imagines that Arthur is a fisher king, and sitting fishing becomes a sort of allegory for a quest for fertility, the fish being fertile, the fish being a phallus, and in this regard, the fish being kind of a grail. And when Arthur recovers, if he can, the fish, the grail, then he will become whole again. And because in the Grail legend, the king and the land are one, the land will become whole, healthy as well. T.S. Eliot, in his notes to The Wasteland, mentions a famous book by Jessie Weston called From Ritual to Romance. And in that book, Weston talks about the pagan roots of the King Arthur legend and how the Arthur legend moved from these pagan roots to a Christian form. Of course, in Christianity, the idea is that the Holy Grail is the cup from which Jesus drank during the Last Supper. It also may well have been the cup that caught the blood of Christ when he was on the cross dying. Christ's contact with the Grail, the cup, allegedly gave it holy power, the power to heal. Now, Weston argues that this basic Arthurian myth of the land falling into waste, the king himself falling into ill health for whatever reason, maybe because his wife had an affair with Lancelot, the king falling into poor health and sending his knights out on a quest to recover the Grail. And when the Grail is recovered, he is returned to health and the land is returned to health. Weston finds that pagan fertility myths underlie this basic story, that the Grail, though in the Christian tradition is spiritual, in the pagan tradition, the idea was that every spring the land had to recover its fertility. It had to overcome winter. Sometimes this would have been marked by an old king being killed by a young king. James Fraser makes much of this in The Golden Bough, another work that T.S. Eliot mentions in the notes to The Wasteland. But basically for Weston, the Grail is a spiritualized version of a fertility ritual that would mark the waste of winter being overcome by the vitality of spring. Carl Jung, the depth psychologist of the early and mid-20th century, studied these Grail legends, much as Weston and Fraser did, in great detail. And he ultimately said that the Grail symbolizes not so much a spiritual talisman that can provide eternal vitality, but rather the Grail is a symbol for an ideal self, wholeness. When you feel mentally healthy, let's say, when you feel that your reason and your emotion and your physicality and your sensations are all working in harmony, that your unconscious urges are in sync with your conscious forms. This is achieving a kind of grail existence. So for Jung, the grail isn't so much, again, an external, it's inward, that we each have a grail within. And the goal of psychoanalytic work is to find your own grail. So what do we have in play here? We have the basic myth of the grail as it exists in the wasteland and as it is discussed in Weston's For Mitchell Romance. The grail as any power that allows one fertility that empowers one to achieve victory over waste, depression, listlessness, lethargy. And the grail not only can heal you, but it has a societal healing power as well. At least that's what Eliot desires in The Wasteland. Jung takes this very same dynamic and just puts it inside. Not that T.S. Eliot does not. T.S. Eliot certainly suggests that we each have a grail within, but Jung makes this overt, that each of us has a grail within, and when we achieve a kind of mental health, that is achieving, realizing our own grail. Now, what does this have to do with John Boorman? John Boorman, in his film about Arthur King, the sculpture, is clearly kind of putting the Eliot grail and the Jung grail both into play. The idea that a sculptor might be able to create something, a shape that is external, and his meditation on it can give him power and vitality. But ultimately, this power and vitality is inner, an inner peace, an inner verve. What happens? John Boorman will basically explore this Arthurian myth in several of his early films, but he will do so ironically. What does that mean? I'll tell you. In his very first big Hollywood studio film called Catch Us If You Can, about the Dave Clark Five, it was meant to be a sort of rip-off of the Beatles' Hard Day's Night, which was extremely successful. The idea was, well, Dave Clark Five has a hit song, Catch Us If You Can. We can make a film about them that's kind of zany and silly, like Hard Day's Night, and we'll make a lot of money. Well, Boorman wasn't interested in that. He wanted to make a movie about deflated idealism. He wanted to make a movie about a quest for a utopia that fails because of the superficial urges of the modern world. Dave Clark plays sort of himself, a stuntman, and he and a young female friend, Dinah, played by Barbara Ferris, she's a model, they make their way across England, this sort of picaresque, meeting all these different people who are examples of different ways one might find happiness. But ultimately, they want to get to an island called Berg off the coast of Devon. And they believe that the island is separate from the landmass of England. And if they can go there, they can get away from England and all the advertising and all the materialism and all the greed. Well, it turns out that when the tide is out, one can just walk to the island. So it's not separate at all. So the film ends with a kind of failed quest. It's an ironic quest. The Dave Clark finds what he's looking for, but it turns out it's not what he needs at all. He needs something else. His desire was misguided. So what does he do? He decides to go surfing with his friends. And what does Barbara Ferris do? She decides to go back and be a model again. So the film ends where it began. In Point Blank, a very serious, crime-ridden, violent film that seems diametrically opposed to Catch Us If You Can, has a similar dynamic where you have the main character, Walker, on a quest, walking to recover $93,000 that he thinks is coming to him. He and his friend Mal, with the help of his wife Lynn, perform a robbery. Mal shoots Walker, takes the wife, leaves Walker for dead, takes $93,000 that they've stolen. Well, Walker wants all the money. So in some ways, the movie is a quest for him to recover the $93,000. And he thinks when he recovers the $93,000, he will feel whole again. He's been wounded. He's been shot. He's been betrayed by his wife, just as Arthur was betrayed by Guinevere with Lancelot. Lancelot being his best friend. So you see that dynamic there. It's a very Arthurian kind of film. And finally, at the end, when it seems that Walker might actually get his money, it remains ambiguous. He doesn't even want it anymore because he realizes that in wanting that money, he's buying into a system of greed and capitalism that ultimately wants to reduce him to a cog, to take away his humanity. So there again, his quest is misguided. What he thought he wanted is not what he needs. And when he finds it, he doesn't want it. Now, Boorman is fascinated by this idea as well in Deliverance, where you have 4 men from Atlanta taking a canoe ride in the deep wilderness, hoping they can get back in touch with nature, with instinct, with masculinity, with strength, with cunning, with a very traditional idea of what a man is. Because all of them, except for one character, Lewis, played by Burt Reynolds, feel as if they've somehow lost their manhood living in the modern city. Well, the quest for this manhood, for this grail, goes terribly astray. And Lewis, the paragon of manliness, breaks his leg and might actually lose his leg, we learn by the end of the film. And things just go poorly. Another of the men die, and another man is raped. And the character Ed, played by John Voight, actually ends up having to kill someone, and he feels nothing but remorse for doing that. So he achieves sort of the height of traditional masculinity, killing another man in a duel of sorts. And what is he left with? He feels empty. In 1981, Boorman finally makes his overtly Arthurian film, Excalibur, which is a full-on telling of the Arthurian legend. And in the film, Arthur, because he's so consumed by the responsibilities of a king, can't pay proper attention to his wife Guinevere. She falls in love with Arthur's best friend and best knight, Lancelot. They have a tryst in the forest. Arthur finds out, and his soul essentially becomes ill at that point. He is depressed, he's listless, he's lethargic, he's apathetic. And so the king goes, so goes the land. The land falls into a waste. So Arthur sends all of his knights out to find the Grail, and they all die except for Percival, who persists over years, and finally finds the Grail and brings it to Arthur, and he drinks from the Grail. And he suddenly feels health again, and he asks Guinevere for forgiveness, and she gives him Excalibur, and he rides to battle against his son, a son he's had with his sister Morgana. His son's Mordred. Morgana tricked him into having sex with her and has a son, and Mordred wants to take over the kingdom. So there's that wonderful scene, Carmina Burana by Ort, where the knights are riding through the wasteland, and in fast motion photography, the land springs back to life. It's chilling, wonderful. And Arthur and his army fight Mordred's army, and because Lancelot, who has been a hermit all these many years, comes back and fights, Arthur is able to win the battle. Lancelot dies. Arthur is dying. And the final scene shows over this misty battlefield, Arthur sailing away in a ship, possibly to the land of Avalon. But there again, what does the Grail give Arthur? The minute he finds the Grail, the land comes back to life, but then it's totally overcome by his battle with his own son, and then he dies. So in all of these instances, I would say that Boorman is indicting a certain idea of manhood. He's indicting a certain idea of Western manhood. Maybe we could even say American manhood, even though Boorman is British. And that is that to be a man, one must be able to negotiate one's landscape successfully and achieve one's goal. And what is one's goal? Power, health, vitality. But in each of these cases I've mentioned, when the man actually discovers what he thinks he needs, he is left empty. He is left wanting. In some ways, he's left worse off than he was in the beginning, because now, in the beginning, he didn't have what he wanted, and he had hope. Now he has what he thought he wanted, but realizes it doesn't give him what he needs, and he has no hope. So these ironic quests are indictments of a certain traditional notion of Western masculinity. And we'll see Boorman, in these 4 films I'm talking about, propose alternatives to this kind of masculinity, especially in Point Blank, where we see certain moments where Walker behaves in a traditionally feminine way. And in these moments, he seems to have more joy and connection to himself and the world. And we see in King Arthur the idea of Merlin, who is kind of androgynous, a father and mother at the same time, being sort of another ideal of manhood that the knights don't quite understand. So when you're watching Point Blank, the subject of my latest book, pay attention to Boorman really critiquing what we call toxic masculinity to a certain extent, critiquing toxic masculinity and wondering if there are other healthier ways that a man can be in the world.